A great writer is able to tell stories that are both strange and familiar. We recognize ourselves, or a little bit of ourselves, in the characters. Years ago, when I first read In the Time of the Butterflies, I didn't know about the Mariposa sisters, but when I read about these young women, I saw bits of myself. Rebellious, check. Idealistic, check. And though I'm not from the DR, but from Argentina, trying to make sense of their home country's repressive politics, check. A few weeks ago, in preparation for today and before I got my very own copy of the new book, I read Afterlife. Again, I recognized bits of myself. A no longer young professor and writer, check. A little bit more jaded than the Mariposa sisters, check. Facing all kinds of loss, check. An immigrant navigating the political circumstances of a country that is meaner to its immigrants than it used to be, check. This act of recognition brought me in and helped me listen more carefully to that which was not familiar. The tiny details sharply observed and the characters demanding attention and empathy. I'm so honored to get a chance to thank you personally for this experience of reading and listening.
Thank you.
And not just on my behalf, but also on behalf of my students. We have been reading your books together for years. Sometimes we cry when we read them together, but we are always grateful. So Julia Alvarez seems always to be writing. She's written 9, to my count, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, 9 novels, 3 books of poetry, 11 books for young and very young readers, 3 books of essays. She was a recipient of the National Medal for the Arts, recognized by President Barack Obama for her extraordinary storytelling and the ways those stories reveal human capacity for strength in the face of suffering. She's won numerous awards for her work, including the Pura Belpre and America's Award for Books for Young Readers, the Hispanic Heritage Award in Literature, and the F. Scott Fitzgerald Award for Outstanding Achievement in American Literature. She's also opened the field and supported the next generation of Latina, Latino, Latine, Latinx writers, including Elizabeth Acevedo, who was here. I don't know if you remember, it was a wonderful afternoon. Angie Cruz, Edwidge Dantica, and so many others. Of course, I can't not mention that she was honored by Barbie a few years ago. Each year, they choose women who are extraordinary role models and they make dolls in their likeness. So there is a Julia Alvarez doll. In a gracious interview after she was so honored with her usual ability to say a lot with just a few words, she said, "It feels odd to be a doll." Now, there must be a story there, and I'm hoping you will tell it to us someday. This brings me to the new book, which is of course full of stories and people I won't forget, but it's also a meditation on who gets to tell stories, which ones need to be told, and importantly, which ones need to remain untold, buried with their owners. This is not just a book about telling, it's a book about listening. And she reminds us that listening is everything. So it's our honor and such a pleasure to welcome Julia to our campus today. She'll read briefly from her new book, and then I will get to ask the first questions, and then I will open up the floor for audience questions. So please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming Julia.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. I'm honored by that introduction. Thank you. And thank you to everybody responsible for bringing me here. Paul, Jen, as you mentioned, Mark. I'm going to forget people. I always get a little nervous that I'll forget someone that deserves to be celebrated and acknowledged. And in fact, the novel is dedicated to just those people, Anon, all those anonymous people that never get to hold a microphone or tell their story, and who enable so many others to do their work, and that remain invisible unless they find a good listener. And so thank you for also highlighting that listening is maybe the hero of this novel, listening. And so I'm just going to read briefly from the second part of the novel, but to set it up just a bit, because since it just came out, I don't know how many people have read it and know the story. It's the story of an older writer, Alma, AKA, her pen name is Scheherazade, because she's run into family flack about her writing, and so on the advice of a writer friend, she uses the pen name of the mother of all stories, Scheherazade of the Arabian Nights, Scheherazade. And she's an older writer now. She's had a good run, but she's run out of creative stamina. And she decides that the time has come to put her writing life to rest. So when she inherits a piece of land in a barrio in the Dominican Republic, a kind of deserted, abandoned, worthless piece of land next to the town dump, she decides that she's going to take all her failed manuscripts and rough drafts and never fully realized characters and lay them to rest there. So we follow her in the first part of the novel and learn a lot about her and her background. And then in the second part, we shift and we're in the barrio. And all of a sudden, construction is going on in this abandoned plot. And so all the people in the barrio are very curious, and they all have chismes, which is the grassroots root system of literature. Chismes, stories, what's going on, what's going to come here. All these stories are circulating. And so I'm going to pick up there where we meet the foreman. After several weeks of bulldozing and clearing, a stucco wall goes up, topped not with the broken glass or concertina wire, but with fanciful ironwork, butterflies perched atop flowers, birds taking flight, dolphins leaping into the sky. A children's theme park? A private primary school? An art academy? The foreman seems to be the only person the locals can find to talk to them. He knows very little, but he tells them what he knows. The place is to be un cementerio. A cemetery? Muertos and zombies roaming the streets at night, encampments of the homeless, defecating behind mausoleums and burning their cooking fires on Abuelita's gravestone. And what jobs will a cemetery provide that anyone but the desperate would want? The people in the barrio may be poor, but they have their pride. Insulting enough that the city dumps its trash in their backyard without now adding to that injury with its dead. The foreman reassures them, bunching his lips at the fanciful wall with its playful sculptures. This is not to be a run-of-the-mill cemetery, but a place of mucho respeto y orden. No riffraff, no freeloaders. As for spirits and ghosts, there be none of those either, as this is not to be a cemetery for people. Para mascotas, entonces? Those who work as maids and gardeners know firsthand how attached the rich are to their pets. When their little dogs die, the owners mourn them more than they do other people's children. But generally, these pets are buried on the grounds of their owners' estates. The foreman shakes his head. No, the cemetery is not for pets either. But if not for pets or animals, who is it for? This is as much as the foreman has been told. All he knows is that he has never felt happier in a job. For the first time since he became a foreman, he pitches in, working the backhoe, removing stones alongside his Haitian crew. He leaves the job refreshed. No need to stop on the way home at the barra or colmado and pick up a bottle of ron and drown himself in forgetfulness, ignoring his mujer and swatting at his kids if they make too much noise. Instead, he converses openly with his wife and children, remembering things he has forgotten. Amorcito, his wife teases, did you eat parrot for your almuerzo today? The owner stops by to review the progress of her project. A skinny woman with a lined face, graying hair, and an unpronounceable name that sounds like Che Guevara. Doña, he addresses her by way of avoiding it. No, Doña, just call me Alma, la Doña says, shaking his hand like a man. She is accompanied by a small, energetic woman with the easier name of Brava, about the same age, but half the size of the other. One would think she is a dwarf, but all her body parts are in the right proportions, except for her large workman hands. She talks a mile a minute. The locals continue to pester him, so the foreman decides to go ahead, phrasing his question as a community request. The people in the barrio would like to know who the cemetery will be for, if not for people or pets or toxic materials. The owner laughs, a bright, sharp sound which ignites the small one's laughter. Perdón, she apologizes. I don't mean to be secretive, just that people never understand when I tell them it's going to be a cemetery for stories. The foreman shakes his head, the way he does at the beach to get water out of his ears. Cuentos, he repeats. The women laugh again. Yes, he has heard correctly. Interesting, the man says, so as not to appear ignorant. Next time someone asks, he says the cemetery is for los locos, the crazed, the deranged. But wait, aren't locals people too? I'm just the foreman, he shrugs. A sign goes up on the wall at the main gate. Cementerio de Cuentos Nunca Contados, a cemetery for untold stories. The only way to enter is to speak into a small black box at the front gate. Cuéntame, a woman's soft voice requests. Tell me a story. Only then does the door open, or not. So, now you know.
Thank you so much. So I have some questions. I was lucky enough to read the book before today, and I noticed that even in the passage that you read it's very exemplary of what happens in a lot of the book, which is that you get a lot of voices. There's lots of voices there, and the main character, who is sort of setting everything in motion, we don't hear from her that much. It's as if she's framing everything and she's setting everything up and she's opening the floor to let everybody else tell their stories. And so I'm wondering, how did you come to that formulation? How did you decide to sort of make her central but not central in the ways that the stories are told?
Well, I think a writer is never central. You know, I think in our celebrity-making culture, we focus on the writer, but the writer is like the horse that carries the story. And you have to train the horse, you have to develop your craft, and you have to practice. But really, the story is, you have to be humble before the story and follow the story. And not let the tyranny of what really happened to you as the writer be what dictates what happens in the story. The story has its own demands, the characters, and the story itself. So I'm so glad you notice it, because as you read the novel, we start with a writer, and she's in a celebrity culture and she wants to make it. But as the novel proceeds, she fades more and more, and she becomes, because it's the stories that take over, and the tellers that never get privileged or the opportunity to be listened to. And they're really the heroes, along with Filomena, of the story, yeah, of the novel.
Yeah. So these stories, and who gets to tell them, and the ones that remain untold, I'm wondering, do you have in your head a difference between an untold story and a secret?
Well, I always used to tell my students, when they didn't know what to write about, that, first of all, if an idea comes to them and it's labeled resident, ignore it. But if an idea comes to them, or a bubbling up, and it has their name on it, that's the story they have to tell. And it's a story that makes them a little uncomfortable. It stirs something in them, a little bit of tension, maybe just thinking of as they write, maybe they burst into tears. That means there's gold in them there hills. It's not comfortable. And also it means that for the writer, there will be discovery as well as the reader. And that's when there's juice in the writing. You know, Frost famously said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And so there's got to be, you know, something of that in how I think you get to a story, but definitely, I don't know where I was going with that, but it was something definite.
A lot of what happens even in the reading and in so many of your books is this kind of thinking through and identifying the specificities and the identities that immigrants make. But then also pushing that and challenging the stereotypes and really sort of not letting anybody off the hook in a way. And you do this so much in terms of language, right? And the ways that language works. And there's this really wonderful moment in Afterlife where Antonia, who's a retired professor who's been in the US for a long time, is thinking about the word for childbirth in Spanish. And she's thinking, dar a luz, right? And she realizes that that's very specific and very different from parir, right? And she realizes kind of the class assumptions embedded in each of those. And so I would really love to hear you talk about, you know, language and how you go about sort of thinking through those kind of very minute distinctions and really using that to open up a very broad range of, you know, what people call immigrant experiences or however you want to frame that.
Well, because sometimes I find it insulting that we just have one story. You know, we're as complex as a ethnic group, a racial group. I mean, we're as complex as any other group of people. And we're not even a group that's got a cohesion.
Right.
We're different races, we're different ethnicities, we speak different Spanishes, etc. And so we need to claim as writers that complexity for ourselves and not just fall into the cliches that maybe mainstream publishers will want, you know, you to write that story of being an immigrant. There is no that story. Adichie's famous, "The Danger of a Single Story," applies to any group. So I've wanted to have that kind of, you know, complexity. And in terms of language, I began as a poet. So I paid Emily Dickinson, and here I am doing what Antonia does, my head full of quotes from teaching for so long. Emily Dickinson said, there are no approximate words in a poem. So you have to hone in. And something that I thought was a drawback with being a writer was that I came to this country and really into the English language at 10, really thrown into the deep end of the pool. And I thought that was a handicap. But actually, I was learning language intentionally. So I was really paying attention to the words. When you learn it as a mother tongue, you're just learning words as people are swirling around you. But when you're a young immigrant, you think, what's the difference between being glad and being happy and being joyful? You know, you're starting to, because it matters for you to get access to what is coming at you from these speakers. So you pay attention to language in an intentional way. And then my first love being poetry and how I got started, I was always revising and thinking, well, is that quite the word for what I want? You know, and sometimes I throw in Spanish because at first that was forbidden. It would be circled in my workshops. You know, please translate this. You can't have a Tia Rosa in a story. It has to be an Aunt Rose. I was back in those days, right? So, but sometimes there's a word will only really hit it with putting the Spanish in. And what I love about American English, it's a malleable tongue. We don't have an Academia Real de la Lengua Americana. No, we don't judge what words come. It's messy, the United States. Whitman called it the barbaric yak of English. You know, it's just got influences from all over.
Yeah.
So I'm just importing my Spanish into English.
Yeah, and this is what makes your work so rich to teach, You know, I mean, we can dive in and really think about these words and pull out their meaning, and people make connections and all kinds of things. And so my question, this next question is a little bit of a tough one. I'm sorry.
No, I just don't want to forget where I'm going.
So you've spent some time on campuses. I know you're a writer in residence at Middlebury, and I'm wondering how you have responded and how we should respond to a kind of national devaluing of literature and the humanities in the university, especially in the public university, where, you know, sometimes people think that that's not what people ought to be studying, that's not where the resources ought to go, and, you know, these spaces where students can kind of read and listen and build empathy and think about the nuance, they're disappearing. They're dramatically reduced in the spaces of the university. And so what advice do you have for professors, for students, for administrators? How do we deal with that?
It's just that, I mean, we're seeing the repercussions of not having humanities, readers, thinkers in the culture. These divisions and these fake facts, and no one being a real critical thinker, and often demonizing each other. And the kinds of skills that you learn about critical thinking and empathy, because when you read, you become someone else. I mean, it's as basic as that. And if you keep stretching those muscles, they're the same muscles as compassion, empathy, trying to understand the other who is not like you. And we're losing those skills. And those skills don't happen automatically. They happen through reading and education and learning about a variety of things, not just your specialty, because then you get in your bunker, in your gated community from the get-go, intellectually. And that kind of spread of possibility that comes from the humanities, that's what's important. It's not that, oh, they need to read Shakespeare or they need to do, it's not any specific content, but the combinations and the skills that you learn from immersing yourself in a variety of disciplines. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Wow. But it is troubling, I know. And we were talking beforehand of what we're seeing in the culture and how people don't develop those skills of, okay, you know, this guy's claiming this and that, let's research it, let's think about it, let's discuss it in a civil way, let's think of possibilities, let's be inclusive. Those things come from the humanities,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, one last question, not a hard question. Can we talk about sisters? There are so many sisters in your books. Is this going to be
on YouTube? Because I have some people watching me over my back, my sisters, my beloved sisters.
They're kind of this kind of hilarious, unruly, tragic, loving kind of chorus in your books, and I love them. And so I want to talk about how sisters are sort of almost always or often the fundamental relationship. You know, sometimes there's romantic relationships and there's other things, but it's the sisters really who are the ones.
I think of them as my Greek chorus in a Greek play. You know, they have commentary, they have warnings, they have criticisms. You know, they're constantly swarming around the main action with their input. And I did, you know, I mean, many of my characters have my DNA, of course, my imaginative DNA, and I grew up in a family of all girls, all sisters. And, you know, I grew up in a very patriarchal culture, but I didn't experience, and with a patriarchal dictator, you know, El Jefe, the big daddy. So I grew up with that. But I didn't experience the culture that way, because the men left to go to work, and then it was the tias and your abuelita and the niñeras, and it was a swarm of women, all great storytellers, swarm of women. So I experienced life from that kind of group sisterhood, if you think of it, of sisters as generations of women coming together. I grew up in that. And so I've always been interested in that point of view. And part of the reason that I got involved, that I wanted to write those stories that are in the García girls, how the García girls lost their accents, is that I read Piri Tomás and Oscar Ibuelos, and I wanted, what was the immigrant experience like from a female point of view? And with the Mirabar sisters, it was perfect. They were 4 sisters too, you know? And the one who survived, who's the storyteller, Dede, was the second one, and I'm the second. So it was like there was a green light from the universe on that one. But I was interested in that case. There were many stories about the dictatorship and the underground and the male heroes and the dissidents. But what was it like from a female, not just a female point of view, but from a female body to be in that dictatorship? Because the dictator preyed on women, and any woman he wanted, he had the droit de seigneur. So I was interested, what was that experience like, that visceral fear of being preyed upon within that culture at that time? So again, it was sisters, not my own, but I was interested in that dynamic as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's just my real life. It's no fun having a writer in the family. You know, I would say, but look, if you read a novel, because they'd recommend novels where there were all these women characters that were a bit like us later on, when they would recommend to me novels, I would say, but if I wrote it, you'd be pissed off. Yeah, because, you know, we want equal time. I said, well, write your own book.
There's so much love and just fire in all of the sisters in all of the books, and I really appreciate them.
Thank you.
I think we have some time for questions. Yeah.
You raise your hand, bring the microphone around.
I keep spilling this on myself.
Okay.
Hello there. Thank you so much for coming. I haven't read your most recent book, but I have read In the Time of the Butterflies, which I thought was incredible. But about your recent book, if this has already been answered within the narrative, very sorry, but would you consider this a ghost story? And like, are you haunted by like the stories you did not tell or you didn't have the time to tell?
A ghost story, I love it. It could be a ghost story. But that's a good question, because one of the things I wanted to do with the Cemetery of Untold Stories is I have an older writer, and just as I was interested in the nuance and complications of being Latina, I'm interested, as I grow older, there's a kind of ageism in fiction. I think it's changing, but you know, the old person is on the first page, dying on the deathbed, reads out his will, and then he's gone. Or it's a sweet grandmother or abuelita. They're like these background characters. So I wanted to immerse myself in old age, and in this instance, the old age of a writer, not just old age of a woman, but a writer who has dedicated her life passionately to a craft and is bringing it to a close. What is that about? And I recently read about there's a Canadian critic, Constance Rock, and she's come up with this new term called the Volendungsroman. I don't know that I've pronounced it correctly. And it's the opposite of the Bildungsroman. It's, instead of the coming of age novel, the novel of completion, the novel of old age. And I'm very interested in that landscape, partly because I want to learn. I look in books to understand what is happening to me and my contemporaries, and I want to travel that landscape of growing old. So I didn't think of it so much as a ghost story, but it's a person on her way to becoming a ghost. Even, as I said, she kind of starts to disappear and become less of a focus in the novel. So instead of the portrait of the artist as a young man, this is the portrait of the artist as an old woman with the added complication of a Latina woman many of whose stories have come from somewhere else. But the reason that the part of your question was asking, am I haunted? I think as a younger writer, I have all these boxes and folders and drafts. Someday I'll get to that, I promise them. You know, someday I'll get you in a book, this character, or this situation. It seems like you have endless time to get it all down. And when you get to be my age, you have to understand it's not going to happen. But they're still there. They're still haunting you. You're still possessed. There's still ghosts in your head. And so, as a Caribeña, we need our little rituals of exorcism and santeria. And so, how to lay them to rest? Because it's not going to be you that tells that story. And maybe it'll never get told. So there's that part of it too, the ghosts that are in the writer's head. Behind you.
Yes.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much for being here, and I just want to thank you also for being the representation for young Caribbean women. Everyone that I know read your books growing up, and definitely into adulthood, so you were the representation that we always needed. I wanted to ask a little bit about your use of humor in your books. You are very great at weaving in the humor, be it through nuance of just being Caribeña and what that experience is like, whether it's family parties in the García's family house, sometimes even between the Mirabal sisters and poking fun at each other. And so I'm wondering how you're able to find that balance between talking about really difficult topics and also making sure to include that humor while I'm sure navigating a world as a woman that's a writer, but also as a Caribbean writer, needing to be taken seriously in order to continue your craft.
Wow, I just think humor is survival. That to see humor, to have humor is to have a sense of perspective. So you see the clashes of things, and there's a humor in there. But the deep rootedness of humor, I think, is compassion and love. And part of the reason of laughing is that you embrace the full diversity of each person. And we're all full of contradictions and flaws. And as a writer, to portray that, to embody that, creates a kind of, well, humor, laughter. But it's laughter that is serious laughter, if you can think of it that way, that oxymoron or that contradiction. It's both. Thank you. She's referring to my books for young readers. I have a series, the Tia Lola stories, and Tia Lola, the first one is how Tia Lola came to visit, except the visit is scratched out and it's stay. How Tia Lola really came to stay, and we do that in our cultures. We have familia that comes and never leaves. And the second one was how Tia Lola learned to teach. Oh, about being haunted by characters, I just meant to write one. And she stuck around. So I had to write a second one, how Tia Lola learned to teach. And then she still wouldn't leave me alone. So I wrote how Tia Lola saved the summer. And then I said, one more only, one more. So how Tia Lola ended up starting over is the last one. But yes, the humor, her cariño and her encounters, because part of humor is, you know, you're moving into a world that doesn't really want you or that you understand, and so there are a lot of goofs and things you do wrong, and that can be a source of humor. But with Tia Lola, she manages to win the community in a lily white Vermont town. She doesn't even know English, but she has a universal language, which is humor. She knows how to laugh, and she knows how to love. I mean, what else do you need, right? And as a young immigrant reader, as a young immigrant, oh, those are the things that make you feel welcome. You know, not, I mean, the official thing is maybe getting a green card, being allowed to stay, but the laughter and the warmth and the love is what really makes you feel like you've landed somewhere that's safe and home.
You can ask your question, you just have to project this microphone.
But you say something about your poetry. I know in the beginning of your career you wrote some poetry. I wrote a poetry blog on Facebook, and I posted your poem, You Close, which got a very good reaction. It was like people were commenting that they didn't know you wrote poetry, and they were delighted with that poem. So I'm wondering if you could say some words about your poetry.
Oh, poetry is my first love. And I think it was my first love because I missed, you know, my mother tongue and my homeland. And poetry, because it was cadenced and musical, and the rhythm really felt like a language that I could connect with more than the prose at first. And so it's my first love. And actually, my next book is a book of poems. I have I think it's 3 books of poems. And then I've been writing them all along, but nobody wants to publish poetry. Thank goodness for people like you that celebrate it and have a blog on it, because publishers, I don't know, you know, it's not going to make money and so forth, but it is still my deepest, most profound love. And so, yeah, I'm writing poetry, and I think it's, even in when I taught at Middlebury, I retired in 2016 from the college. Even my fiction writing, prose writing workshops, I always made them start with writing poems. We didn't sign up for the poetry work. No. Let's start with the atoms, you know, and get them thinking about words and how to use them. So poetry, yes, is my first love. And it didn't just start in English. You know, when we were little in the Dominican Republic, I don't know that this happens anymore. We had to recite poetry. We had recitations. When company came over, we would have to, we each had our little repertoires, and we would be put in our party dresses and marched out, and each one did a poem. And so I loved it. I have any poem that was read to me often enough, I knew by heart. And I would recite it. So I think that's the root, maybe, of why I love poems. They're at the heart of my love affair with languages.
Yeah, she has a question, right?
I met you in 1995 at Brevo. I went to Brevo School of English, which is part of Middlebury College. And I wondered, because I know that you live in Middlebury, how living in Middlebury has influenced your writing.
Wow. Because of course it comes, I mean, I've lived in Vermont now longer than I ever lived even in the Dominican Republic, which I call my homeland, you know. So I feel very connected to Vermont, and I find that some things about being in a rural community, we actually don't live in Middlebury but in Weybridge, which is very much a farm community, is very connected to the culture, the rural culture that I experienced as a child in the Dominican Republic, because basically it was still a rural country. And the fact that we look out for each other, no matter your politics, when you're stuck in a ditch and your neighbor goes by with a tractor, you ain't gonna ask any questions. You know, you're not gonna say no. It's just connected that way. And we share in the rhythms that are the rhythms of all stories. The births, you know, that are our neighbors, someone with a new baby, deaths, someone experiences a loss, a wedding, a graduation. It's even written up in the town paper. I mean, little things like that. There's going to be a picnic, you know. There's going to be a rhubarb festival. All those things, I feel like you have your hand in the pulse of the grassroots of this immense country. And that's something that as a writer also is so wonderful. It's enriching because you're with people, not institutions or corporate structures. And you know, when you also, it happens in cities, if you move into a barrio or into a neighborhood, that you're in that, at that level with people, that we lose that connection in many of very mobile cultures, big cultures, urban cultures, people coming in and out. And you have that there in our little state of Vermont, you know. It's still there in many pockets.
I had one question. You shared your husband Bill, who's here. We should recognize your husband Bill, but what you're doing in Dominican Republic with the Mariposa organization, and could people here get involved with that?
Absolutely.
Tell us about that.
Oh my goodness, thank you for that, Paul, because they love to welcome student groups that go down. Mariposa Foundation, and first a big shout out for Bill, who says, you know, Bill is a wonderful support, a real muse of a man for a writer. But the great thing too is that I used to worry when there was a husband in my novels after we married, that I would get in trouble, you know? And never at all. The last novel, Afterlife, it's no spoiler because it happens on the first page. The husband dies. He's a great guy. He's a little bit of a know-it-all. Not at all like my husband. But people would call and say, "Is Bill okay?" And so when my sisters would complain about something, he says, "What have they got to complain about? I get killed on the first page." They get to hang out for the whole novel. But anyhow, Mariposa Foundation is a wonderful organization in the Dominican Republic. It was started by an American woman from New York State, Ithaca, and she had an eco-tourism company that she started in the DR called Iguana Mama. And as she was taking groups through the back country, she was really stricken and struck by the extreme poverty of the countryside. And so she sold Iguana Mama, and she had read a novel called In the Time of the Butterflies. This is what stirs me about stories. And I'm not saying this because it's my book, but that a story can plant a seed in someone that makes their own flowering happen. So she read this book. She decided she was going to start an organization to create the mariposas of the next and the next generation. So Mariposa Foundation takes girls that are in the community of Cabarete. It's a coastal community, resort community, lots of sexual tourism, young girls that get roped into that because it's, when you're impoverished, that's a way that maybe you can get out of that cycle. Anyhow, she takes these girls from 8 to 18 and she educates them. She gives them skills. They have a coffee shop they run. We had a farm in the DR and we've donated it to the Mariposa Foundation. Now they have a mountain campus for those interested in environmental and agriculture that is eco-friendly. And so that's a study that they're now doing, but they do amazing work. We now have at Middlebury College a young Mariposa. I mean, she graduated from the program and she's on full scholarship at Middlebury College, a hard college to get into. And she's flourishing, and there are many, many graduates, but the reason that it's great, because she welcomes groups. A group often goes down from Middlebury College and they spend their spring break, or many come for the summer. Several graduates, after they graduate, have gone there and they've been co-directors and done work for the program. So Mariposa DR Foundation, it's wonderful because these young girls get this young population that comes in and they get inspired and they want to keep learning and they get incentivized. And so it's a wonderful program that she started, and Bill and I are still very connected with it because she's done amazing work. Amazing work. Tricia, her name is Patricia Thorndike, but she now goes by Tricia, and she married a Dominicano, so she's Tricia Suriel. So it's wonderful organization.
One more question.
That sounds great.
We'd love to detain her forever, and we can't, and it wouldn't be fair to her. But I think we'll take one more question since we started late, and we'll take a last question from Alejandra if she'd like to ask one. So
I saw a hand raised here a lot, and I don't see very well anymore, but I see.
Yes.
Obviously, some of us never lose our accent. I'm Dominican, and I am very interested in that foundation from Alvarez. I have a question about in the time for butterflies. When you immerse yourself in your research, this particular time, did you ever visit the place where Las Hermanas Mirabal?
Absolutely.
Where they were found?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The question is about the Mirabar sisters, and I very much am a writer that works by, the fancy name is research, but I have to go there and touch and feel the pulse of a place, meet the people that survived and knew the people I'm writing about, listen to their stories, so that I'm not just going in and sort of colonizing the story with my imagination, but to listen, which is why Filomena is such a hero for me, to really listen to the stories and to go places, because you can't get this stuff, if you want to get the minutia, the detail that makes a fiction become real to the reader, you have to catch those little details, and they're not often in the general history or the succinct story, but your eye catches them so that you see things. So when I was writing about the Mirabar sisters, we, with Bill, again, wonderful research assistant, we just ran all over the island. We met Dede. We became very close to the family. We went to the place where they were killed. We met other dissidents, the ones that had survived. We even went to the church where the priest that had married them met him. Actually, he wasn't at the church. We couldn't find him anywhere. And then one of the people on the street told us, oh, he's over at the discotheque. Oh, okay. See, this is humor. The priest and the discotheque was hot pink. And he was there, and he says, oh, that's, many of my parishioners, that was his, many of my parishioners hang out here, so. And you have to, the thing is that sometimes it becomes so interesting that you have to say, okay, ya, se acabó. You have to go to work, because there's always one more little thing you want to find out.
I'm happy to cede my question to the audience.
Okay. Last question.
One back there, yeah.
As someone who also knows multiple languages, how does your writing process work? Do you think both in Spanish and English, or do you take your time in English, or do you take your time in Spanish?
This kind of came up when I think it was you, Mark, worried about whether to say Julia or Julia, and I answer to both. And this is the thing, that when we came to this country, there was no such thing as bilingual education, multicultural studies. We were punished by the nuns if they caught my sisters and I speaking in Spanish in the playground. So it was discouraged. You had to choose. Either or, either this or that. And I don't think we diaspora people are either ors. Those languages are slushing around in our heads, mixing and messing with each other, And I think of them as, depending on what I'm working on. For instance, people would think that they could catch me if they say, well, what do you dream in? I would say, well, if Papi comes in my dream, we speak in Spanish. But if it's the chair of my department, we speak in English. I didn't get that division inside me, so it seemed artificial and nerve-wracking that I had to pick. So I think I'm dominant in English, and that's because of the situation I just explained. I was made to focus just on my English, and it was encouraged also at home because Mommy and Papi wanted us to fit in and survive, so they encouraged us, so I became English dominant. But I realized that a lot of times I'm speaking my Spanish in English. And by that I mean the way I hear English, the rhythms, the vocabulary, the characters. I think all of these things are part of one language infusing another. So the distinction for me, I would have to make it up. And when I'm talking to people who are similarly diaspora, you know, this mixture, when I'm talking to my sisters, we're constantly going back and forth and mixing it up and sometimes doing it as a form of humor. So I don't separate them. Or they don't separate themselves. Languages love each other. They're permeable and porous. And what?
They are part of the same me.
They're part of the same me, así mismo, right? And sometimes only like a little, you know, a palabrita. I love my hitos that we add at the end out of affection. You know, we can't do that in English. We can't say certain things in English. And in Spanish, we can't say other things. And we don't have a word like in Brazilian Portuguese that, or the one that, is that the one that means running your fingers lovingly through someone's hair? I mean, there's one word for that. I want that word. Right? Isn't that beautiful? I have it written down. I do this whole thing about languages and how we need each other. Where did ketchup come from? India, the word. You know, what would we do without ketchup? All right? Fiesta. We use it. We invade each other. We don't, yeah, I think I made my point.